Hiya! Welcome! This documentary review for me has been at least 3 years in the making. I'll explain. It must have been about 3 years ago, might even be a little bit more now, when on this channel I reviewed the exceptional 1973 Thames television series The World at War, a 26-part epic covering all the major and even some of the minor aspects to World War II. It was a landmark series in British television history and in documentary making. And I said at the end of that video, and you can go and check that out in my films and documentary reviews playlist if you haven't seen it yet, but I said that there would be only one other series, one other documentary that I would rate higher than The World at War. I rated that at 9.5 out of 10, but I said there was something else, and I was determined to review it one day on this channel that I would give 10 out of 10 to. So the day's come. So you already know the score for this. This is a 10 out of 10 documentary for me. Maybe the only one I'd ever give 10 out of 10 to that I've seen so far in my life, and I've watched a lot of documentaries. I've been putting off this review for quite some time. Well, firstly, I had to re-watch the series. It is a series of 7 episodes or films, but mainly because I was just always worried that I wouldn't be able to do it justice, and I still don't think I'm going to be able to do this series justice by talking about it, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it and try and keep this review fairly snappy and concise, but let you know just what an absolutely outstanding series, an outstanding piece of documentary filmmaking this is. And what I'm talking about is this documentary series from, I think, 2010. Have you heard from Johannesburg?
If you take into account the average life, grow up, have an education, you get hold of a job, you have children, retire, live comfortably, and then you die. That's one life. But if to that life is added that you served for what is the finest cause, that's the liberation of people from the yoke of bondage, how much fuller is that?
Seven stories of the global anti-apartheid movement, produced and directed by Connie Field, and the quote on the front of the little DVD box, I know it looks like CDs, but these are DVDs. It says, Best Documentary of 2010, Time Out New York and The Village Voice. I first became aware of Have You Heard from Johannesburg? God, it must be 9, maybe even getting on for 10 years ago now. And I saw the last, it was 2 or 3 episodes of the 7-part series on BBC4, and to the best of my knowledge they've never repeated it since, and this is, you know, a decade or so back. I've looked on iPlayer, I still look every now and again even though I've had this DVD set for some years now. I watched the last 3 because I'd missed the first 4 or 5 or however many it was that I didn't see initially on the BBC, and I thought, wow, this is just so thorough and fascinating. For me, this is, without wanting to sound too trite, my generation's version of The World at War, because a lot of this is, and we'll get onto certain dates depending on which of the films I'm talking about within this box. A lot of this happened in my lifetime, you know, when I was young, admittedly. You know, 1980s into the turn of the 90s. I'd always wanted to watch this in full, you know, watch the whole thing, and it just wasn't available anywhere. in the UK anyway. Obviously, if you're in a different country and you can access this on some sort of streaming platform, then do let me know in the comments. What I ultimately had to do was to go on the, it's the Clarity Films website, which is a US production company, and import this from the US. Fortunately, these DVDs are all region free, so they will play here in the United Kingdom without any fiddling around with your equipment, as it were. Expensive, but it was the only way I was ever going to see it again. And even still, that was when did I buy this set? Like 7 years ago maybe. I'm a bit rusty on the dates because it's been so long, but I've had this set for a long time, but this is only the second time I've actually watched it from start to finish. Just to give you a bit of the bump on the back, Have You Heard from Johannesburg is 7 documentary stories chronicling the history of the global anti-apartheid movement that took on South Africa's entrenched apartheid regime and its international supporters. Yeah, that really tells you all you need to know about what this series is about. It's about South Africa and their apartheid policy, which began in, and it does cover it obviously on the first film, which is this one here, Story 1, Road to Resistance. It takes the history of South Africa up from 1946, when they first started enacting apartheid laws. I mean, I'm sure most people watching this who do know what apartheid is or was. To put it in simple and maybe oversimplistic terms, apartheid was a policy in which mainly blacks, but also to a large extent other mixed race people, Indians, Asians, etc., didn't have the same civil rights and the same quality of living as white people in South Africa. There is so much more to it than that, and obviously this is just a full-on history of apartheid in South Africa, at least from the midpoint of the 20th century, and it's just excellent. This first one here, the first film in the series, is 65 minutes, and that's, I think, one of the shorter ones in the series. It covers what happened to the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, of course. He got jailed, we thought, for life in the 1960s. An absolutely outstanding series. I keep saying it, but the one downside to it, if you can say it's a downside to it's not a downside to the film, it's a downside to its availability or lack of, but it's just difficult to find unless you don't mind importing it for quite a lot of money. I think this cost me probably about $80 or $90 to buy, and it was the only place I could find it anywhere. I couldn't find it on eBay, Amazon, on any streaming platform or on-demand service. So there's the second disc, hell of a job, and this covers a lot of the work done by ANC Deputy President Oliver Tambo, who essentially went into exile from South Africa because had he gone back to South Africa, he would have been arrested and thrown in prison for life like Nelson Mandela was. It shows all the work Oliver Tambo did around the world, particularly in Europe, where there was big anti-apartheid movements building up in countries like the UK and the Netherlands, who have kind of like a historical and linguistic link to white South Africa. I'm not rating these films, these episodes separately. As a whole, the series is just a must-watch as far as I'm concerned. And, it brought back some memories seeing some of this. Obviously, stuff from the 1940s through to the late 70s, early 80s, I wasn't around for, but I was thinking during when I was watching this back to my childhood and the apartheid struggles, the anti-apartheid movement in the UK and all around the world for that matter was very prevalent still, even though I think by the mid-80s and certainly the late 80s, early 90s, when Nelson Mandela finally got released and then black South Africans finally got full civil rights, as it were. But I remember being a pretty young child and my parents would have on the BBC News or the ITN News, and you can guarantee there'd be at least 1 out of 3 different main news topics on the news broadcast every night, and it'd be either the coal miners, the Northern Ireland Troubles, or apartheid South Africa. I have quite vivid memories of all that sort of stuff, and it's not just from watching the news either. I do remember sometimes going shopping with my mum, and bear in mind this is over 35 years ago, so I would have been 7, 8, 9 years old at the oldest really, and seen posters and displays for outspan oranges, and knowing my mum wanted to buy little oranges, I'd say, oh, are you getting those? And she'd say, no, I don't buy those because they're South African. One, actually arguably two, of the films here kind of focus on the boycott of South African produce and the divestment of the South African economy to try and weaken the white minority government into repealing these apartheid laws. Film number 3 is called The New Generation. This covers the period 1968 to 1977. A lot of stuff about Steve Biko here. I won't talk too much about him or any of the other people in this film, like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, because you may know a lot of stuff anyway, but if you don't, then it's just worth reading up about and reading and watching as much as you can. You know, this is at the top of the tree for me when it comes to learning about apartheid in South Africa, really, this whole series. Film number 4, Fair Play. This is a very interesting one for anyone into sports because it covers how South Africa was viewed in the sports community, and there was certain countries who would still allow South Africa, you know, rugby and cricket mainly, but other sports as well to an extent, to tour in their countries. Countries like Australia and New Zealand, there was major protests against South African rugby players coming over. It was almost like sort of rioting and civil disobedience about South Africa and about apartheid, but in countries that didn't even have those laws. But that's how strong the anti-apartheid movement was at that point. Of course, South Africa, they would have got banned from the Olympics and FIFA and all the other sporting governing bodies eventually by like the 1960s or 70s, I think. Another interesting thing about this series is, although it's not something I've bothered with, you get like the full versions. So this edition, this episode, for instance, Fair Play, the full length is 96 minutes, but most of these discs, not all of them, the first one doesn't certainly, but most of these discs also have a shorter version of the film on. I don't know, it might be some educational thing really, where like they make an edited version of the film to put on. So if you're playing it in like a classroom or at a college lecture or something like that, and you've not got a massive amount of time, you can watch the abridged version, which on here is 52 minutes. But I've never bothered watching the short ones. I like all the extra information and interviews. And that's an interesting point, really. There's a lot of interviews from people on every side of the apartheid thing up to the late 80s when the system finally started to crack. You know, a lot of people, sort of white South African politicians who, you know, seemed quite contrite, but was sort of maybe kind of justifying their policy and how their government behaved throughout this sort of 50-odd year period. And there's even one or two who still seem a bit resentful that, oh, well, you know, we thought we were doing the best for everybody, which, you know, is difficult to believe given the absolute hardships of black people in South Africa, just being sent to these absolutely desolate townships where there was no chance of growing anything. They had no money to build, you know, they could barely feed and clothe their families, while at the exact same time the white minority were living it up in the cities and in the suburbs, earning money and going on whites only beaches and going into whites only public bathrooms and things like that. You look back on it and it feels like a different world, but this is stuff that was still happening in my lifetime, or in the early part of my lifetime. Film number 5 is called From Selma to Soweto. This one is very American centric. The whole documentary series is American produced, by the way, and it shows how the US came to be involved in the anti-apartheid campaign, and how African Americans, they altered US foreign policy so that US corporations and the government started taking funds out, divesting funds from South Africa. The penultimate film in the series is The Bottom Line. This one goes into more detail, which is touched upon in the previous one, but this one goes into a lot more detail about all the companies and businesses, most of them American, but there's some British ones mentioned, like Barclays Bank, for instance, who either decided to or were kind of arm twisted to pull out of South Africa. Shell Gas is another one that was boycotted. I mean, Shell was, and I think still is, just like one of the major oil companies and has been for a long time. So for them to pull out of that part of Africa was massive, really, for unsettling the government there. And the final film, film number 7, is Free at Last. Of course, everyone likes a happy ending, and there they are, Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. Mandela's free in, that would have been 1990, I think. The dates on there, it's a bit difficult to read. I think he became president in, was it 94? There again, short version on here, but the full version, 78 minutes. All of these films are at least over an hour, some getting on for an hour and a half in their full-length forms. I don't really want to speak too much about any specific content, and I would love to tell you, go away and watch this, but as far as I know, it's still not really available unless you don't mind importing this series from America like I did. The only other way to watch this that I noticed a few years ago, and I should have looked before I started filming this, and if it's still the case, I will leave a link at the top of the description, but the only way I was aware that you could watch this that wasn't buying the DVDs from Clarity Films was a few years ago. Vimeo had every episode up, you know, the video hosting site, but it was for rental, so you had to pay, I don't know the amount, but you got like 30 days rental, and you had to rent each episode separate as well, which wouldn't have suited me because I knew this was a series that I wanted to go back to time and time again, and I will watch this again in a few years' time. It is just so powerful, and the music on it is wonderful. The talking heads, the people who are being interviewed are fascinating. The archive footage from all around the world, you get stuff from Britain, the Netherlands, America, Australia, New Zealand, France, South Africa, obviously. You know, there's just so much of it, and it's just all so well put together. The director, Connie Field, has just done an absolutely exceptional job here, as far as I'm concerned, with Have You Heard from Johannesburg. It's a 10 out of 10 from me. So that's all I'm going to say about this one. Absolutely wonderful stuff, uplifting. It's harrowing at times, you know, there is scenes of violence and rioting as you would expect, but it's all recent world history and geopolitical recent history. You know, it's important that we don't forget this sort of thing, because it only takes a few bad decisions and a few bad apples for things like this to start happening again in parts of the world. But thank you all for watching this documentary review. Sorry it's taken me all these years to do it, but this was something, it was an ambition of mine to talk about this at least a little bit on this channel, and I'm pleased that I've been able to do so today. Special thanks go to my wonderful subscribers and generous patrons. I'm going to go now, and please will you join me again next time for my next documentary review. Cheers everyone. See ya!